we often run into a little bit of confusion between ryegrasses and winter rye, and even within the ryegrasses there are different types. So when you're ordering your seed, a lot of times there's confusion between what you're asking for in retail, and sometimes you just don't get what you're looking for. So today we have a great demonstration of the differences between the rye. We're standing in front of winter rye or fall rye, which is really the same thing. And this is really a cereal, so rye cereal. So because this is a winter rye, it doesn't stretch out the way a spring crop does, like these oats here. These oats are planted in the spring, they grow, and they'll go to seed in the same season. Winter rye, traditionally planted in the fall. It goes through that vernalization period where it goes through a cold period, and then it'll stretch and go to seed the next year. So these plots were planted on July 13th, and it is now the 22nd of September. So this rye has not gone through a cold period, therefore it has not stretched out and gone to seed. This rye will continue to put out tillers and more tillers, become more and more dense, but will not go to seed that first year until it goes through a cold period.
And you'll see that a lot of these tillers will actually start to die off. So there's quite a bit of leaf disease here, and you don't typically see any breeding efforts to get rid of leaf diseases in rye. It's typically a common rye.
As you look down the plot, you can see that the rye is very good at outcompeting weeds, and we know that rye itself exudes a chemical through the roots that will discourage weed seed germination. So moving on to the ryegrasses, which are true grasses. The first one we have in our plots here is an annual ryegrass. This will be planted, and if there's enough season, will go to head that first season that is planted. If you plant it late in the fall, it may not have enough time to mature during that period, but it's going to try to produce seed in that first season. Depending on your cropping system, this may be very detrimental because it'll become a weed in future years.
This is a particularly hard to control weed in a lot of your horticulture crops, so do be careful when you're planting an annual ryegrass. If you mow it, however, it's not going to set ahead, so if you have those capabilities. And then some of the varieties are later heading, so if you only want cover through, say, July or September, if you're planting earlier in the spring, a later heading variety might be a good choice for you.
So this being an annual rye, it should winter kill going through the first winter and should not last into the next cropping year. So continuing on with our ryegrasses, which are actual grasses, this is perennial ryegrass. So you can see it came up very dense, and this will sit ahead in that first year, the planting year, but it will also overwinter, survive the next year if we don't terminate it. You can see that there's not a lot of heads in this plot yet, but if you have enough season left, you can feel the joint there where my fingers are, and it's trying to produce a head. If we have a longer season, it will go to head in that first year. Ryes typically don't have great winter survival, so you may see some winter kill in your perennial rye plantings, but typically there's enough that survives that it becomes a problem if we want to do a vegetable crop afterwards or a field crop afterwards. So we still have to come through and terminate it somehow, even though we may have poor winter survival.
Again, if you have the capabilities of mowing it and keeping an eye on it, it can delay that heading, so you will get more root growth and more biomass growth over the course of the year, but definitely keep an eye on those seed heads.
So what we have here is our last type of ryegrass. It's an Italian ryegrass. The genetics of this are a little bit different than the others. In a more southern climate, this will act as a biennial. So it'll go vegetative in that first year, goes through vernalization period, a cold period, and then it'll put seed heads up and go to seed in that next year. So this is very advantageous to us in some systems because we don't have to mow that head off in that first planting year because it's not going to produce seed. What happens in our climate is that it typically winter kills before it has a chance to go through that vernalization period and produce seed the next year. In a very mild winter in the Maritimes, this can overwinter, or you can get some winter kill, but not enough to terminate at all. What happens in those cases is very quickly in the next spring, it comes back to life and goes to head on you. So here in the Annapolis Valley, you look at it the 1st of May, you think, geez, there's not much out there. By the end of May, it's a pretty dense crop, and it's quickly going to seed on you if it does overwinter.
If you wanted to kill this with an herbicide, Sonny, what would you use?
I would use quite a high rate of Roundup, and you bring up a good point. All of the true ryegrasses are quite resistant to low rates of Roundup, so if we want to kill it, we want to use quite a strong rate of Roundup. So that can be done in the fall, or it can be done in the spring.
How late in the fall would you push it with that herbicide application?
So I like to push it a little bit late because you get a lot of energy going to the roots, and you get a lot more root growth through the late fall period. So I like to be second week of November, that kind of thing. If you go to the spring, you've got to be a little bit Johnny on the spot with your sprayer. You want to wait till it wakes up so we have active growth, but you don't want to let it go too long that it's starting to go to that jointing phase that we talked about before. So you want to be 4 to 8 inches of regrowth, but before it goes to that jointing phase, and you can get a much better kill on it in the spring. So again, in the spring, you want to go with that fairly high rate of glyphosate again. The other thing that they've done in some studies is they've mixed their glyphosate with a group 1 grass herbicide, and they found that they got a much better kill with that addition to the tank.
For those who don't use herbicides, Sonny, how would you terminate this?
It's a little bit difficult. So you're really counting on a winter kill, and then you want to follow that up with tillage. I would do that tillage, depending on my system, fairly early in the spring before we got a lot of regrowth. And it's kind of funny, you look at this grass May 1st and you're thinking there's not much ryegrass out there, but by the end of May we get that little bit of heat, and there can be quite a bit of biomass there. Once you start getting that regrowth, I think it's going to be a lot harder to kill it with tillage.
And simple disking would be sufficient, you think, or you really kind of got to do more of a rototill?
No, I think disking would be enough. So here you can see the root structures of the different types of ryegrasses. On the right hand side we got the winter rye or fall rye, which is actually a cereal. You can see quite a bit of the leaf disease and senescence at the base of the plant, but still great root structure. And it's really that fine roots that are binding your soil together, giving it the structure that we're looking for. Next to that, we have the annual ryegrass. Not quite as much root structure, but we can see the above ground biomass as it's going ahead. And probably what's happening inside that plant is it's putting the energy into growing seeds, heads, rather than more root structure. Beside that, we have the perennial rye. Quite a bit of root mass to it, quite a bit of above ground biomass as well, but it's setting itself up for overwintering, right? So it has more root structure to it. On the extreme left, we have the Italian ryegrass. Up above it, you can see that it has quite a bit of root structure, that fine fibrous roots again that we're looking for. Very interesting that all the ryegrasses, you know, even though they have that great root structure, are not very deeply rooted. So what we tend to see in some cases is that they don't come through a drought very well. In the odd case on sandy soil, we'll often see them burn out entirely.
So if you look at this Italian ryegrass, it doesn't look like it's doing much, but when you look at that root ball, for how little above ground biomass is there, that is a lot of root growth. And you can see that it's really holding that soil in place well beyond where those plants are. So this would really protect you quite well from erosion. So you can see here with this perennial ryegrass how you have this like, it looks like the soil is kind of coating each of those little roots. And this is where that like soil microbiology plant interface is. Basically the roots are exuding sugars, and that soil microbiology is just kind of sucking it up and starting to create some more stable soil aggregates.